Twins Murdered in 1966, Birthday Party Massacre. Chapter 1. The Perfect Suburban Morning. May 14, 1966 was supposed to be a celebration. Jennifer and Jason Miller were turning 10 years old, and their mother, Carol Miller, had spent the entire week preparing for their birthday party. The house on Oakwood Avenue in Livonia, Michigan, a quiet suburb west of Detroit, was decorated with colorful streamers, balloons, and a hand-painted banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Twins." Carol had baked 2 cakes the night before, one chocolate for Jason and one vanilla for Jennifer, both decorated with pastel frosting and 10 candles each. The backyard was set up with folding tables covered in plastic tablecloths, paper plates with cartoon characters, and cups for punch. Everything was ready for the 2:00 party start time. Robert Miller, the children's father, worked as an engineer at Ford Motor Company. He'd taken the afternoon off to help supervise the party, something he rarely did given his demanding work schedule. But the twins' 10th birthday felt significant, a milestone worth celebrating properly. Carol had invited 15 children from Jefferson Elementary School, where Jennifer and Jason were both in the 4th grade. The twins were fraternal, not identical. Jennifer had straight blonde hair that fell to her shoulders and green eyes like her mother. She was quiet, studious, and loved reading mystery books from the library. Jason had darker hair, brown eyes, and was more outgoing. He played Little League baseball and collected comic books. Despite their different personalities, they were close, often finishing each other's sentences and defending one another against schoolyard conflicts. That morning, Jennifer and Jason opened presents from their parents at breakfast. A new bicycle for Jason, a set of Nancy Drew books for Jennifer, and matching wristwatches for both of them. The twins were excited, talking rapidly about who from school would be coming to the party, what games they'd play, whether the weather would hold for outdoor activities. The forecast called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures in the low 70s, perfect spring weather for a backyard party. Carol checked the yard one more time around noon, making sure everything was in place. She'd planned games including Pin the Tail on the Donkey, a 3-legged race, and musical chairs. Robert set up a borrowed record player on the back porch with a stack of 45s, popular songs the kids would recognize. By 1:30, Carol was dressed in a yellow sundress, her hair styled carefully. Robert wore slacks and a short-sleeved button-down shirt. The twins changed into their party clothes. Jennifer in a pink dress with white trim, Jason in a blue polo shirt and khaki pants. They looked perfect, like children from a magazine advertisement for suburban American life. The first guest arrived at 1:55, Susan Hartley, Jennifer's best friend from school. Her mother dropped her off with a wrapped present and a promise to return at 5 o'clock. Within 10 minutes, more children arrived, most dropped off by parents who waved from their cars before driving away. This was 1966. Neighborhoods felt safe. Parents trusted other parents. Children played outside unsupervised. The world hadn't yet learned to be as cautious as it would become. Chapter 2. The party begins. By 2:15, 14 children were gathered in the Miller backyard. The 15th invitee, Tommy Chen, called to say he had a cold and couldn't attend. Carol didn't mind the smaller number. Fewer children meant easier supervision, though Robert was there to help anyway. The party started with free play in the backyard. The boys gravitated toward Jason's new bicycle, taking turns riding it around the yard while making engine noises. The girls gathered around Jennifer, admiring her new books and her watch. Carol brought out bowls of potato chips and pretzels, placing them on the tables along with the punch bowl filled with bright red fruit punch. Robert put on music, and some of the children started dancing awkwardly, the way 10-year-olds do when they're still figuring out rhythm and coordination. Laughter filled the air. It was exactly the kind of party Carol had envisioned. Simple, wholesome, happy. Around 2:45, Carol organized the first game. Musical chairs was always popular, and she'd set up 9 chairs in a circle. 10 children participated in the first round while the others watched. Jason won, pumping his fist in victory, while his competitors groaned good-naturedly. Jennifer came in third, eliminated when the music stopped, and she lunged for a chair a split second after another girl. The games continued. Pin the Tail on the Donkey caused hilarity when one boy, blindfolded and spun around, walked in completely the wrong direction and nearly pinned the tail on Robert instead of the poster. The 3-legged race resulted in multiple tumbles and grass-stained clothes, but no injuries more serious than scraped knees that Carol tended with Band-Aids from the bathroom. By 3:30, it was time for cake and presents. Carol brought out both cakes, lighting the 20 candles total. The children gathered around the picnic table, singing Happy Birthday, loudly and off-key. Jennifer and Jason stood together, grinning, and blew out their candles simultaneously. Carol cut slices of cake while Robert scooped ice cream. The present opening was chaotic in the way these things always were. Jennifer received books, art supplies, a board game, and a stuffed animal. Jason got baseball cards, a model airplane kit, more comic books, and a toy car. Each time they opened a gift, they thanked the giver politely, just as Carol had taught them. It was 3:55. The party would end at 5 o'clock. Carol started thinking about cleanup, about how she'd package leftover cake for guests to take home. She was mentally planning the evening. A quiet dinner, the twins spending time with their new presents, early bedtime for everyone after the excitement of the day. She had no way of knowing that in minutes, everything would shatter. Chapter 3. Something Wrong. At 4 o'clock, Carol noticed that Jennifer wasn't in the backyard. Most of the children were still playing, their energy somehow renewed by sugar from cake and ice cream. Jason was showing his new comic books to 3 boys near the garage, but Jennifer was missing. Carol called her daughter's name. No response. She walked toward the house, thinking Jennifer might have gone inside to use the bathroom. Robert was organizing a game of freeze tag with several children and didn't notice Carol's concern yet. Carol entered the house through the back door into the kitchen. "Jennifer?" she called again. The house was quiet. She checked the first-floor bathroom. Empty. She went to the living room, then the dining room. No sign of her daughter. A small worry began forming in Carol's chest. Nothing severe yet, just the natural concern of a mother who can't immediately locate her child. She climbed the stairs to the second floor where the bedrooms were. "Jennifer, honey, are you up here?" The twins' bedroom door was closed. Carol knocked, then opened it. The room was empty, neat except for discarded wrapping paper from the morning's presents. She checked the master bedroom, the guest room, the upstairs bathroom, all empty. Carol went back downstairs and out to the yard. "Robert," she called, her voice carrying an edge he recognized immediately. He excused himself from the game and jogged over. "I can't find Jennifer." Robert's expression shifted from casual to alert. "When did you last see her?" Carol thought back. "During the cake?" "Yes." Jennifer had been there. During the presents? Also, yes. But after that, with all the children running around, Carol had lost track. Maybe 20 minutes ago? 15? "She's probably just inside somewhere," Robert said, but he was already moving toward the house. Carol followed him. They searched together this time, more systematically. First floor, second floor, basement. They called Jennifer's name repeatedly. The house remained silent, except for the sound of children playing in the backyard, filtering through the walls. Robert checked the garage. Carol's car was there, parked as always. Garden tools hung on the wall. Bikes and outdoor equipment were stored neatly. No Jennifer. Could she have left the yard? Carol asked, her voice rising. "Gone for a walk? Without telling us?" Robert shook his head. "That's not like her." But they expanded the search anyway. Robert walked up and down Oakwood Avenue, looking in neighbors' yards, checking behind bushes and trees. Carol stayed at the house, searching the backyard more carefully, looking in the small playhouse, behind the shed, anywhere a 10-year-old might hide. By 4:15, panic was setting in. Carol asked Jason where his sister had gone. Jason shrugged, confused by his mother's distress. He'd been busy with his friends. He thought Jenny had been playing with the girls. Susan Hartley, Jennifer's best friend, said she'd seen Jenny go toward the house around 4 o'clock, maybe a little before. She'd thought Jenny was going to the bathroom, but that was 15 minutes ago, maybe longer. Robert made a decision. "I'm calling the police." Chapter 4. The Discovery. While Robert went inside to call the police, Carol continued searching, her movements becoming more frantic. Other children started noticing something was wrong. The party atmosphere evaporated, replaced by confused concern. Some of the younger children looked frightened by Carol's obvious distress. Robert called the Livonia Police Department from the kitchen phone. He explained the situation. His daughter was missing from her birthday party. The dispatcher asked standard questions. How old? 10? How long missing? Maybe 20 minutes, possibly longer. Any reason to think she ran away? No, absolutely not. Any family disputes? No. Any suspicious people in the area? Robert paused at that question. There was Harold Kemp, the man who lived 4 houses down. Kemp made people uncomfortable. He was in his early 40s, lived alone, had no obvious employment. and spent a lot of time watching children in the neighborhood. Parents had talked about him, shared warnings to keep kids away from his house, but nothing had ever been proven. No charges filed, just an uncomfortable feeling. Robert mentioned Kemp to the dispatcher, who noted it. A patrol car was being sent immediately. Robert hung up and went back outside. He pulled Carol aside and told her about the call. Police would arrive within minutes. Carol's mind was racing through terrible possibilities. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep searching. She walked to the front of the house, looking up and down the street. The neighborhood was quiet. Lawns neatly trimmed, cars parked in driveways. It looked safe, peaceful. How could a child vanish from such a place? 4:20. The first police car arrived, pulling up in front of the Miller house with lights flashing but no siren. 2 officers stepped out, one older with gray hair, one younger and clean-cut. They introduced themselves as Officer William Davidson and Officer Thomas Brennan. Robert and Carol explained the situation rapidly, words tumbling over each other. The officers listened carefully, taking notes. They asked to search the house. Robert agreed immediately. While Officer Brennan began a methodical search of the property, Officer Davidson stayed outside with the family, asking more detailed questions. Had Jennifer seemed upset about anything? No. Any problems at school? No. Boyfriend troubles? She was 10 years old. No. Any reason she'd want to hide or run away? None at all. This was her birthday party. She'd been happy, excited. Officer Davidson asked about the other children at the party. Were they all from school? Yes. Were parents staying, or had they dropped off and left? All had left. Did the Millers know all the families? Most of them, yes. Then the officer asked about neighbors. Anyone concerning? Robert mentioned Harold Kemp again. Officer Davidson's expression changed slightly, recognizing the name. Kemp had been questioned before, on different occasions, about complaints from neighbors. Nothing had stuck, but he was known to police. It was 4:28 when Officer Brennan called out from inside the house. His voice was controlled but urgent. "Detective Davidson, you need to come here. Now." The tone made everyone freeze. Officer Davidson moved quickly toward the house. Robert started to follow, but the officer held up a hand. "Sir, please stay here." Carol grabbed Robert's arm. She knew. Somehow, she knew. Her knees started to buckle, and Robert had to hold her upright. The children in the backyard had stopped playing, sensing that something terrible was happening. They clustered together, quiet, frightened. Officer Davidson disappeared into the house. Seconds ticked by, stretching into agonizing minutes. When he emerged, his face was pale. He walked directly to his patrol car and picked up the radio, speaking in low, urgent tones. More units were being called. Detectives, an ambulance, though anyone could tell from his expression that an ambulance would be too late. Robert pulled away from Carol and ran toward the house. Officer Davidson moved to stop him, but Robert was faster, driven by desperate need to see his daughter, to help her, to fix whatever was wrong. He burst through the back door into the kitchen. The basement door was open. Officer Brennan stood at the top of the stairs, blocking the way down. "Sir, you can't go down there." "That's my daughter!" Robert's voice broke. "Sir, please. This is a crime scene now. You can't contaminate." But Robert had already seen past him, down the stairs to the basement floor. The image would burn into his mind forever, never fading, never softening with time. Jennifer lay at the bottom of the basement stairs, her pink birthday dress torn, her body positioned wrong, too still. And next to her, Jason, his blue shirt dark with blood, his eyes open but not seeing. Robert made a sound that wasn't quite human, somewhere between a scream and a sob. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees. Officer Brennan caught him before he could fall down the stairs himself. In the backyard, Carol heard her husband's anguished cry. She knew what it meant. Both of them. Not just Jennifer. Both of her children. Her twins. Her babies. The sound that came from her throat brought neighbors running from their houses. The children at the party started crying, not understanding but knowing something horrible had happened. By 4:35 on May 14th, 1966, the Miller house was a crime scene. The birthday party had become a massacre, and Livonia, a quiet suburb where nothing bad was supposed to happen, would never be the same. Chapter 5. The investigation begins. Detective Raymond Walsh arrived at the Miller house at 4:52. He was a 20-year veteran of the Livonia Police Department, experienced in violent crime, though most of his cases involved domestic disputes or bar fights. Child murders were rare, horrifying and career-defining. He parked behind the growing collection of police vehicles and walked toward the house, noting details automatically. Neat lawn, trimmed hedges, American flag on the porch, decorated for a birthday party. The scene should have been innocent, but yellow crime scene tape was already going up. Officer Davidson briefed him quickly. Twin 10-year-olds, birthday party, 15 children present. Girl went missing around 4 o'clock. Search revealed both twins dead in the basement, based on preliminary observation. Blunt force trauma, possible sexual assault pending medical examination, occurred within the last hour. Walsh absorbed this information with professional calm, though inside he felt the same horror everyone felt when children were victims. He asked about the parents. Father had seen the bodies briefly before being pulled away. Mother had not. Both were being attended to by officers and neighbors. Medical personnel were on scene administering sedatives. The children who'd been at the party were gathered on the front lawn with 3 officers watching them. Most were crying. All looked traumatized. Walsh knew they'd need to be interviewed, but carefully, with parents present. This was going to be a nightmare of witness management. Walsh entered the house through the front door, nodding to the officer stationed there. The kitchen showed signs of party preparation. Dirty dishes, empty cake plates, punch bowl still half full. Normal domestic chaos. Nothing suggesting violence. The basement door stood open. Walsh descended the stairs carefully, watching where he stepped. A photographer was already documenting the scene, flashbulbs popping. The medical examiner, Dr. Philip Rosenberg, was kneeling beside the bodies. Walsh had seen death many times, but this was different. These were children, dressed for their birthday party, killed in their own home, while friends played outside. Jennifer Miller lay on her back, her dress torn and pushed up, ligature marks on her neck, defensive wounds on her hands. Jason Miller was a few feet away, face down, his skull crushed from behind. Dr. Rosenberg looked up as Walsh approached. Time of death approximately 30 to 45 minutes ago, so somewhere between 3:45 and 4:15. The girl was strangled, likely manually before the ligature was applied. Signs consistent with sexual assault. The boy was struck from behind with a heavy object, probably died instantly. Both children put up some resistance. Murder weapon? For the boy, something heavy and blunt. Based on the wound pattern, I'd guess a pipe or bat. Haven't found it yet. The girl's murder weapon was her own birthday ribbon, pulled from her hair and used to finish what the manual strangulation started. Walsh felt bile rise in his throat. He swallowed it down. Order of deaths? Best guess? The boy first, quickly, to eliminate a witness or threat. Then the girl. The killer took time with her, which is why she shows more signs of struggle. Sexual assault completed? I'll know more after the autopsy. But preliminarily, yes. This appears to have been the primary motivation for the girl. The boy's death was incidental, eliminating a witness. Walsh walked the scene carefully. The basement was partially finished, used for storage and a small workshop area. Tools hung on the wall. Hammers, saws, wrenches. A piece of pipe was missing from a rack, leaving an empty bracket. That was probably the murder weapon used on Jason. Blood spatter on the concrete floor, marked where Jason had fallen. Drag marks showed Jennifer had been moved slightly from where she was initially attacked. Her shoes were off, lying a few feet apart, suggesting she'd kicked during the struggle. The basement had 2 exits. The stairs Walsh had descended, leading to the kitchen, and a bulkhead door that opened to the backyard at ground level. Walsh checked the bulkhead. It was unlocked, opening easily. This was likely how the killer had accessed and exited the basement without being seen by the party guests upstairs. Walsh climbed back upstairs and went to the backyard. The bulkhead doors were positioned behind the garage, partially hidden from the main party area. Someone could have opened those doors, gone down into the basement, and not been noticed by the children playing and parents supervising, especially during the chaos of games and cake cutting. But how did the twins end up in the basement? Were they lured? Forced? Did they go voluntarily with someone they knew? Walsh returned to the house and found Officer Davidson. I need to talk to the children. Not formal interviews yet, just initial information. Get parents here first. Nobody goes home until we know what they saw. Chapter 6. The Witnesses. By 5:30, the Miller property was crowded with police vehicles, an ambulance, the medical examiner's van, and cars belonging to parents who'd rushed over after being called. The bodies had been photographed extensively and were now being removed, black body bags on stretchers, a sight that would haunt everyone present. Carol Miller had been sedated and was lying down in a neighbor's house. Robert sat in his living room, staring at nothing, occasionally making sounds like a wounded animal. Detective Walsh left them alone for now. They'd need to be interviewed eventually, but they were in no state to provide useful information yet. The 14 children who'd attended the party were separated into small groups with their parents. Walsh had called in additional detectives to help with interviews. He took Susan Hartley first, since she was Jennifer's best friend and likely knew her movements better than anyone. Susan was 11 years old, blonde like Jennifer, wearing a blue dress now stained with grass from party games. Her mother, Margaret Hartley, sat beside her, holding her hand. Susan had been crying and her eyes were red and puffy. Walsh sat across from them in the Millers' formal living room, speaking gently. "Susan, I know this is very scary, but I need to ask you some questions about this afternoon. You're not in trouble. Nobody's in trouble except the bad person who hurt Jennifer and Jason. I need your help to find that person. Can you help me?" Susan nodded, wiping her nose with a tissue her mother provided. "When did you last see Jennifer?" Susan's voice was small. "During the cake. She was right there. We sang happy birthday and they blew out the candles. After that, after the cake was cut and presents were opened, I don't remember exactly. We were all just playing. I was with some other girls. Jumping rope." "Did Jennifer play jump rope with you?" "For a little bit, but then she said she needed to go inside." Walsh leaned forward slightly. "Did she say why she needed to go inside?" "She said..." Susan's voice cracked. "She said Jason wanted to show her something. In the house. Jason wanted to show her something. Did you see Jason at this time?" "No. Jennifer just said Jason told her to come inside." Walsh felt his pulse quicken. This was significant. "Did you see Jennifer go inside?" "Yes. She went toward the back door. I thought she was just going to the bathroom." "Was anyone with her? Did anyone follow her inside?" "I don't know. I went back to jumping rope." Walsh asked several more questions, but Susan didn't have additional information. He thanked her and moved to the next child, a boy named David Murphy, who'd been playing with Jason before the twins disappeared. David told a similar story. Around 4 o'clock, maybe a little before, Jason had been showing off his new baseball cards. Then Jason said he needed to go inside for a minute. He'd seemed excited, not scared, like he was going to get something cool to show everyone. "Did Jason say what he was getting?" "No. He just said, 'Wait here, I'll be right back,' and ran toward the house." "Did anyone go with him?" David thought about it. "I don't think so. But I wasn't really watching. We were all just playing." Walsh interviewed each of the 14 children. The pattern was consistent. Around 3:55 or 4 o'clock, both twins had gone into the house, separately, but close together in time. Multiple children remembered seeing one or both of them head toward the back door. No one reported seeing another adult enter the property or approach the twins, but one child, a 9-year-old girl named Beth Ann Foster, provided a different detail. She'd been sitting at one of the picnic tables, tired from running around, when she saw a man near the bulkhead doors behind the garage. Walsh stopped writing and looked up. "You saw a man? Can you describe him?" Beth Ann scrunched up her face, trying to remember. "He was old, not like Grandpa old, but like a grown-up. He had brown hair. He was wearing a blue shirt." "Did you recognize him? Had you seen him before?" "I don't know. Maybe? He looked sort of familiar." "What was he doing by the bulkhead doors?" "Just standing there. I thought maybe he was Jennifer and Jason's uncle or something. Helping with the party." "Did you see him go into the bulkhead?" "I didn't keep watching. I went to get more punch." This was crucial. Walsh showed Beth Ann photos of several men, including Harold Kemp. Her eyes stopped on Kemp's photo. "Maybe him? I'm not sure. It might have been him. Not a definitive identification, but enough to justify immediate action." Walsh called over Officer Davidson. "Pick up Harold Kemp. Bring him in for questioning, now." Chapter 7. Harold Kemp. Harold Kemp lived at 847 Oakwood Avenue, 4 houses down from the Millers. His house was smaller than most on the street, a 1-story ranch with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. The neighbors complained about the property bringing down values, but Kemp ignored them. At 5:45, as the sun was beginning to set, Officers Davidson and Brennan knocked on Kemp's door. It took several knocks before the door opened. Kemp stood there in undershirt and wrinkled pants, unshaven, smelling of body odor and stale cigarettes. "Harold Kemp?" Officer Davidson asked, though he knew it was him. Yeah, what do you want? We need you to come down to the station and answer some questions. Kemp's expression shifted to wariness. What's this about? There's been an incident on the street. We're talking to all the neighbors. What kind of incident? We can discuss it at the station. Please come with us. Kemp hesitated. Am I under arrest? No, sir. We just need to ask you some questions. You're free to decline, but it would be very helpful if you cooperated. Kemp looked between the two officers, calculating. Fine. Let me get a shirt. He disappeared into the house, returning a minute later wearing a button-down shirt with one of the tails untucked. The officers walked him to the patrol car. Neighbors watched from windows and porches as Harold Kemp was placed in the back seat. Everyone knew he was strange. Now he was being taken away by police on the same day 2 children were murdered. Conclusions were drawn immediately. At the station, Kemp was placed in an interview room. Detective Walsh let him sit for 20 minutes before entering, a standard technique to increase anxiety. When Walsh finally sat down across from Kemp, he studied the man carefully. Harold Kemp was 42 years old, unmarried, unemployed. He'd been receiving disability payments since 1963 after a workplace injury at a factory, though the exact nature of his disability was vague. He had 2 arrests on his record, one for public intoxication in 1960 and one for loitering near a school playground in 1963. The latter charge had been dropped due to insufficient evidence of criminal intent, but the incident remained noted in police files. Mr. Kemp, thank you for coming in, Walsh began, keeping his tone neutral. I'm sure you're aware that something serious happened on Oakwood Avenue this afternoon. I heard sirens, saw all the police cars. What happened? 2 children were killed, Jennifer and Jason Miller. Kemp's face showed surprise, but Walsh was watching carefully for genuine shock versus performance. It was hard to tell. That's terrible. Who would do that? That's what we're trying to determine. Where were you between 3:30 and 4:30 this afternoon? At home. The entire time? Yes. Can anyone verify that? I live alone, so no. Did you make any phone calls? Have any visitors? Order food delivery? No. Walsh made notes. Did you see or hear anything unusual this afternoon? Any people you didn't recognize in the neighborhood? Any vehicles that seemed out of place? I don't pay attention to that stuff. I was watching television. What were you watching? Kemp paused. I don't remember exactly. Whatever was on. Mr. Kemp, several witnesses placed you near the Miller property this afternoon around 4 o'clock. That's not true. I was in my house. A child at the birthday party saw a man matching your description near the bulkhead doors behind the Miller's garage. Then the kid is wrong. Wasn't me. Walsh shifted tactics. Mr. Kemp, you've had some interactions with police before. The incident in 63 near the school playground. I was never charged with anything. I was just standing there. It's a free country. You were standing 60 feet from a playground where children were present, watching them for over an hour. Multiple parents complained. I wasn't doing anything wrong. You've also been seen watching children in the neighborhood. Multiple neighbors have mentioned this. Parents have told their kids to stay away from your house. Kemp's expression hardened. People talk. Doesn't mean anything. Do you know Jennifer and Jason Miller? I know who they are. It's a small street. Have you ever spoken to them? Maybe said hello. I don't remember specifically. Have you ever been inside the Miller house? No. Never. Not even years ago. Maybe helping a neighbor with something? Never. Walsh continued the interview for another hour, circling back to the same questions, looking for inconsistencies. Kemp stuck to his story. He'd been home alone, watching television, hadn't left his property, didn't know anything about the murders. His answers were consistent, but not detailed enough to be verifiable. At 7:30, Walsh stepped out of the interview room to consult with other detectives. They had a witness who maybe saw someone who might be Kemp near the crime scene. They had Kemp's history of concerning behavior around children, but they had no physical evidence connecting him to the murders, no definitive witness identification, and no confession. Hold him as long as we can, Walsh told the team. 24 hours, maybe 48 if we push it. Get a warrant for his house, search everything, and someone track down his employment records, medical records, anything that might give us leverage. By 8 o'clock, a search warrant had been obtained and officers were going through Harold Kemp's house. They found pornographic magazines, which wasn't illegal but was noted. They found a box of newspaper clippings about local crimes. They found trash and filth and a general atmosphere of dysfunction. But they found nothing directly connecting Kemp to the murders. No bloody clothes, no murder weapon, no trophies taken from the victims. The investigation was expanding. But Harold Kemp remained the primary suspect, and he wasn't talking. Chapter 8. The Autopsies. Dr. Philip Rosenberg performed the autopsies on Jennifer and Jason Miller the following morning, May 15th. Detective Walsh attended, as was protocol in homicide cases. The sterile room with its harsh lights and chemical smells was a place Walsh had been many times, but it never got easier, especially with child victims. Jennifer Miller had died from a combination of manual strangulation and ligature strangulation. The bruising on her neck showed hand impressions, larger than a child's hands, consistent with an adult male. After the initial strangulation weakened her, the killer had used her own hair ribbon to complete the job. Dr. Rosenberg estimated she'd been conscious for at least 3 to 4 minutes during the attack, a horrifying length of time to experience such terror. The sexual assault had occurred peri-mortem, likely while she was being strangled or immediately after death. Dr. Rosenberg collected evidence for analysis, though forensic capabilities in 1966 were limited compared to future decades. DNA testing didn't exist. They could determine blood type of biological evidence, but that was the extent of it. Jason Miller had died from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The weapon, consistent with a metal pipe, had struck him with enough force to fracture the skull and cause massive brain hemorrhaging. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. Small mercy in a situation with no mercies. Dr. Rosenberg noted defensive wounds on both children. Jennifer had scratches and bruising on her arms and hands. Jason had a broken finger on his right hand, likely from trying to defend himself or his sister. Both children had fought back. Neither had been strong enough to save themselves. The doctor estimated the time of death for both children between 3:50 and 4:10 p.m., consistent with the timeline established by witness statements. The attack had been rapid and violent, lasting perhaps 5 to 10 minutes total from the moment the twins entered the basement until the killer left. "Any biological evidence from the perpetrator?" Walsh asked. "Skin cells under the girl's fingernails. She scratched her attacker. Blood that's not hers on her dress. Type O positive. And semen, of course, which I've preserved for analysis. Can we type it? Already done. Type A positive, which unfortunately is one of the most common blood types. Roughly 33% of the population." Walsh made notes. "Anything else?" "Fiber evidence. The girl had fibers on her dress that don't match anything in the house. Blue cotton, possibly from a work shirt. The lab will analyze them further." Blue shirt. Beth Ann Foster had said the man she saw near the bulkhead was wearing a blue shirt. Harold Kemp had been wearing a blue shirt when police picked him up. But blue shirts were common. Half the men in America owned blue work shirts. The autopsies confirmed what was already known. 2 children had been brutally murdered by an adult male who'd sexually assaulted the girl and killed the boy to eliminate a witness. The clinical details made it no less horrifying. If anything, the medical precision made it worse, reducing 2 young lives to measurements and wound patterns. Walsh left the medical examiner's office with the autopsy reports and drove directly to the station. Harold Kemp was still being held, now approaching 24 hours in custody. His house had been thoroughly searched. Police had interviewed his neighbors, his former employers, anyone who might provide information about his activities or character. The picture emerging was of a man with obvious psychological issues, possible sexual fixation on children, and no alibi for the time of the murders. But possible and no alibi weren't enough for murder charges. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office needed more. They needed physical evidence, a confession, or a definitive witness identification. They had none of those things. Chapter 9. The Community Reacts. By May 16th, news of the murders had spread throughout Metro Detroit. The Detroit Free Press ran a front-page story. Twins murdered at birthday party in Livonia suburb. Television news covered the story extensively. Radio stations interrupted programming with updates. The crime was shocking, not just for its brutality, but for its setting. A birthday party in a safe suburban neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon. Parents throughout the area panicked. If children weren't safe at a birthday party in their own home, where were they safe? Schools received dozens of calls from parents asking about security measures. Churches held special prayer services. The sense of innocence that characterized suburban life in 1966 was shattered. Oakwood Avenue became a pilgrimage site for grief and curiosity. Flowers and teddy bears accumulated on the Millers' front lawn. News reporters stood on the street, filming reports with the house in the background. Neighbors gave interviews, describing the twins as sweet children who didn't deserve such a fate. Harold Kemp's house also attracted attention, but of a different sort. Someone spray-painted "Killer" on his front door. Another vandal threw rocks through his windows. Police had to station an officer nearby to prevent a full riot. Vigilante justice was a real concern. If Kemp was released, his safety couldn't be guaranteed. Carol and Robert Miller were staying with relatives, unable to return to their house, which remained a crime scene. Carol was under heavy sedation, barely functional. Robert had aged years in days, his face gray, his eyes hollow. They'd lost everything that mattered in a single afternoon. Their children were gone. Their home was tainted. Their life as they'd known it was over. The children who'd attended the party were traumatized in varying degrees. Susan Hartley wouldn't sleep in her own room, afraid that if she closed her eyes, something terrible would happen. David Murphy stopped talking, went days without speaking a word. Beth Ann Foster, the girl who'd seen the man near the bulkhead doors, had nightmares every night, screaming herself awake. Parents struggled to explain what happened to their children. How do you tell a 10-year-old that their friend was murdered, that evil exists in the world, that bad things happen to good people for no reason? Some parents were honest, using the tragedy as a teaching moment about safety. Others downplayed it, saying the twins had gotten sick and died, which their children knew was a lie but didn't challenge. The funerals were held on May 19th at St. James Catholic Church, where the Miller family attended services. The church was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of people standing outside. 2 small white caskets sat at the front, closed, flowers covering every surface. Father Michael O'Brien delivered the eulogy, struggling to find words that could make sense of senseless tragedy. He talked about innocence, about God's mysterious ways, about the twins being in heaven now, safe and together. His words provided little comfort. Jennifer and Jason Miller were buried side by side at Parkview Memorial Cemetery. Carol collapsed at the graveside and had to be carried away. Robert stood like a statue, staring at the caskets as they were lowered into the ground. The entire 4th grade class from Jefferson Elementary attended, clutching flowers, many crying. This was their first experience with death, and it was violent and incomprehensible. Chapter 10. The investigation continues. Detective Walsh worked the case 18 hours a day. He interviewed everyone on Oakwood Avenue, some people multiple times. He reviewed Harold Kemp's history exhaustively. He consulted with FBI agents who specialized in child predators, a new area of law enforcement focus in the mid-1960s. The FBI agents told Walsh what he suspected. The crime showed signs of a sexually motivated predator with possible prior offenses. The level of violence suggested this wasn't a first attack, but possibly an escalation from previous incidents that hadn't been reported or hadn't been solved. They recommended checking unsolved child assaults and disappearances throughout Michigan over the previous decade. Walsh put a team on it. They found several cases that showed similarities. Children approached by adult men, inappropriate behavior, in a few cases physical assault, but none of the cases could be definitively linked to Harold Kemp. He'd been questioned in one incident in 1964, involving a girl at a public park, but nothing had come of it. The physical evidence from the crime scene was processed slowly. This was before computerized databases, before automated fingerprint matching, before sophisticated forensics. Everything was done manually by technicians who were overworked and underfunded. The fiber evidence from Jennifer's dress was analyzed and confirmed to be from a common blue cottonwork shirt. Millions of such shirts existed. The blood type from the crime scene was O positive, the most common type. The semen was type A positive, also very common. Kemp's blood type was checked, A positive. This matched the biological evidence from the sexual assault. But again, A positive was shared by a third of the male population. It wasn't exclusionary, but it wasn't conclusive. Walsh continued interrogating Kemp, who'd been held for the maximum 48 hours and then formally arrested on suspicion of murder. This bought more time but required probable cause. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office was nervous. They had a suspect with a concerning history, placed near the scene by a possibly reliable child witness, with a blood type matching biological evidence. But was it enough for a conviction? Juries needed more. Defense attorneys would tear apart the circumstantial connections. The prosecutor, Martin Richardson, met with Walsh on May 20th. Richardson was a careful man, mid-50s. With a stellar conviction record, he was reluctant to risk on an iffy case. He reviewed the evidence and shook his head. "Ray, I know this guy probably did it. You know he did it. But probably isn't enough. The witness identification is tentative at best. The blood type matches half the men in Michigan. The fiber evidence is meaningless. We have no weapon, no definitive forensic connection, no confession. A decent defense attorney will get this thrown out, and then we can't try him again. Double jeopardy. So we just let him go. Walsh couldn't keep the frustration from his voice. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we need more. Keep investigating. Find something concrete. In the meantime, we can charge him with the loitering near schools from '63, maybe make that stick. Keep him locked up while you build the case. But the loitering charge had been dropped years ago. Trying to resurrect it was legally questionable. Kemp's public defender, a young woman named Patricia Morgan, was already making noise about wrongful arrest and police harassment. If they didn't charge him with murder or release him, she'd file motions that would make the department look incompetent. On May 22nd, 8 days after the murders, Harold Kemp was released from custody. Detective Walsh had no choice. They didn't have enough evidence to charge him formally, and holding him longer would violate his rights. Kemp walked out of the police station into a crowd of angry citizens who'd heard about the release. Police had to escort him to a friend's car to prevent violence. The community was outraged. Protests formed at City Hall. Parents demanded action. The mayor held a press conference promising that the investigation would continue, that justice would be served. But privately, everyone involved knew the truth. Unless new evidence emerged, the murders of Jennifer and Jason Miller might never be solved. Chapter 11. The years that followed. The investigation into the Miller murders continued for months, then years, but produced nothing new. Detective Walsh retired in 1974, the unsolved case haunting him until his death in 1989. Other detectives took over the file periodically, reviewing evidence, occasionally following up on new tips. Nothing led anywhere. Harold Kemp moved away from Livonia in 1967, relocating to Ohio. He died in 1982 from liver disease, never having been charged with any crime related to the Miller murders. His death left the question permanently unanswered. Was he the killer, or had he simply been a convenient suspect with a suspicious history? Carol and Robert Miller divorced in 1969. The trauma of losing their children had destroyed their marriage. Carol died in 1976 from what the death certificate listed as heart failure, though friends said she'd died of a broken heart years earlier. Robert lived until 2003, remarried, but never had more children. He kept photos of Jennifer and Jason on his mantle until the day he died. The children who'd attended the birthday party carried the trauma throughout their lives. Susan Hartley became a psychologist, specializing in childhood trauma. David Murphy struggled with addiction and mental health issues into adulthood. Beth Ann Foster, the girl who'd seen the man near the bulkhead doors, moved away from Michigan as soon as she turned 18 and never returned. All of them, in their own ways, were casualties of that May afternoon, their childhoods ending the moment two of their friends were murdered. The case files from the Miller murders were eventually moved to long-term storage as the investigation went cold. In 1996, 30 years after the murders, a Wayne County judge sealed the files permanently. The decision was made to protect the privacy of the child witnesses, now adults, and to respect the Miller family's request to let the matter rest. The sealed files would not be opened without extraordinary legal justification. True crime enthusiasts occasionally tried to access the files, filing Freedom of Information requests that were denied. Journalists attempted to investigate the case, but hit walls of sealed records and witnesses who refused to speak. The Miller murders became a footnote in Detroit area crime history, remembered by locals but largely forgotten by the wider world. In 2010, a cold case detective named Sarah Chen reviewed the file as part of a broader initiative to apply modern forensic techniques to unsolved murders. She requested the biological evidence collected in 1966, hoping to run DNA analysis that hadn't been possible at the time. But the evidence had degraded over 44 years, and the samples were too compromised for reliable testing. The case remained closed. Chapter 12. The Legacy. The murders of Jennifer and Jason Miller changed Livonia and suburban communities throughout America. The idea that children could be killed at a birthday party in their own home shattered the complacent belief in suburban safety. Parents became more cautious, more protective. Background checks for anyone working with children became standard. Neighborhoods organized watch programs. The innocence of the 1950s and early 60s, when children roamed freely and parents trusted implicitly, died along with the Miller twins. The case also highlighted the limitations of law enforcement in dealing with sexual predators. In 1966, there were no sex offender registries, no federal tracking systems, No coordinated efforts to monitor known predators. Harold Kemp, whether guilty of the Miller murders or not, had been able to move freely in society, despite multiple complaints about his behavior around children. The failure to protect Jennifer and Jason contributed to eventual legal reforms, though those reforms came too late for the Millers. Oakwood Avenue never fully recovered. Property values dropped. Families moved away. The house where the murders occurred changed hands several times, each new owner eventually leaving, unable to shake the feeling of what had happened there. By 2015, the house had been demolished, and the lot remained empty, overgrown with weeds, a gap in the streetscape like a missing tooth. Jefferson Elementary School, where the twins had been fourth graders, held memorial ceremonies every May for several years. Eventually, as teachers and students who'd known Jennifer and Jason graduated or retired, the ceremonies stopped. A plaque in the school library commemorated the twins, though by 2020, most students passed it without knowing the story behind the names. The case appears in true crime databases and cold case websites, usually with limited information due to the sealed files. Theories circulate. Harold Kemp was guilty, but escaped justice. An unknown perpetrator was present at the party and never identified. A random predator happened upon the opportunity. None of the theories can be proven. The truth died with whoever committed the murders. In 2023, 57 years after the murders, a documentary filmmaker contacted surviving witnesses about participating in a film about the case. All declined. Susan Hartley, now 73, sent a polite email. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to process what happened that day. I've built a career helping others deal with trauma, but I'm not ready to relive my own. Please respect that the people who were there have a right to peace." The filmmaker abandoned the project. Some stories, it seemed, were too painful to tell. Even decades later, the Miller murders would remain incompletely documented, known to those who lived through it, but hidden from broader public scrutiny by sealed files and traumatized witnesses who wanted only to forget. Epilogue. Questions without answers. Jennifer and Jason Miller would have turned 67 years old in May 2023. Jennifer might have become the teacher she'd dreamed of being, inspiring students with her love of reading. Jason might have played professional baseball, or become an engineer like his father, or pursued any of the thousands of possible futures that were stolen from him. Instead, they remain frozen at age 10, birthday outfits stained with blood, faces preserved in school photos that their parents kept on mantles and in wallets. They are forever children, forever innocent, forever victims of a violence that should never have touched them. The question of who killed them remains technically open, though realistically, it will never be answered. Too much time has passed. Evidence has degraded. Witnesses have died or lost memories to age. The suspect most closely examined, Harold Kemp, is long dead, his guilt or innocence gone with him to the grave. What remains is the impact, rippling outward from that May afternoon in 1966. Families destroyed, childhoods ended, a community traumatized, legal systems reformed, all in response to 45 minutes of horror in a basement, while a birthday party continued in the yard above. Unaware that everything had changed forever, the sealed files sit in a Wayne County storage facility, boxes marked with case numbers and dates, protected from public view by judicial order. Inside those boxes are crime scene photos, witness statements, autopsy reports, and all the accumulated evidence of an investigation that never reached conclusion. The files will likely remain sealed permanently, protecting the privacy of those who survived while ensuring the details of Jennifer and Jason's deaths remain partially hidden. Oakwood Avenue still exists, though it looks different now than it did in 1966. The trees are taller, the houses have been renovated, and newer families live in most of them. Very few current residents know what happened here more than half a century ago. Life moves on. Communities heal, or at least adapt, but the ground remembers. The empty lot where the Miller house once stood remains undeveloped, as if the earth itself refuses to forget. On quiet evenings in May, when spring weather mirrors that fateful Saturday in 1966, older residents sometimes pause and think about the twins who never got to grow up. They remember balloons and birthday cake, and children's laughter cut short by screams. They remember the inadequacy of adults to protect children from evil. They remember that suburban safety is an illusion, that monsters can live on any street, and that innocence, once shattered, can never be fully restored. Jennifer and Jason Miller, Born May 14th, 1956. Murdered May 14th, 1966. 10 years old forever. Remembered by those who loved them. Forgotten by a world that moves too quickly to hold on to old tragedies. The birthday party massacre remains what it has always been. A wound that never fully healed. A question without an answer. And a reminder that the darkness can intrude anywhere, anytime, even into the brightest celebrations of childhood joy. Chapter 13. The Detective Who Never Forgot. Detective Raymond Walsh retired from the Livonia Police Department on June 30th, 1974, after 28 years of service. His retirement party was well attended, with speeches praising his dedication and conviction record. But everyone in the room knew that one case haunted him above all others: the Miller twins. Walsh kept copies of the case files at home, against department policy, but with tacit approval from his superiors who understood his obsession. In retirement, he spent hours reviewing witness statements, crime scene photos, and forensic reports. His wife, Dorothy, worried about him sitting in his home office late into the night, surrounded by evidence of a crime he'd never solved. In 1976, 2 years into retirement, Walsh began his own informal investigation. He tracked down Harold Kemp, who was living in Cincinnati, Ohio, working at a warehouse and keeping a low profile. Walsh drove to Cincinnati 3 times, watching Kemp's movements, hoping to catch him in suspicious behavior that might justify reopening the case. But Kemp lived quietly. He went to work, went home, occasionally visited a bar. He had no known friends, no romantic relationships, and kept to himself. Walsh couldn't observe anything actionable. On his 3rd trip, Kemp spotted Walsh watching him and approached his car. "I know who you are," Kemp said through the driver's side window. "You're that detective from Michigan. You think I killed those kids." Walsh said nothing, just stared at him. "I didn't do it," Kemp continued. "I know you don't believe me. Nobody believed me. But I was home that day. I didn't touch those children. You're wasting your time." "Then who did?" Walsh asked. Kemp shrugged. "How would I know? I'm just the convenient suspect because I'm different, because people don't like me. But being unlikable isn't the same as being a murderer." Walsh wanted to grab him, to shake a confession out of him, to make him admit what everyone suspected. But he had no authority here, no badge, no legal standing. He drove back to Michigan frustrated, and no closer to closure than he'd been 8 years earlier. In 1982, Walsh learned that Harold Kemp had died. Liver failure, the death certificate said, complications from years of heavy drinking. Walsh felt cheated. If Kemp was guilty, he'd escaped justice completely. If he was innocent, the real killer was still unknown, and Kemp had been unfairly suspected for 16 years. Either way, Walsh had failed. Dorothy found her husband crying in his office the night he heard about Kemp's death. It was the only time in their 42-year marriage that she'd seen him cry. The Miller case had broken something in Raymond Walsh, some fundamental belief in justice and order that couldn't be repaired. Walsh died in 1989 at age 67. His obituary mentioned his distinguished career, but made no specific reference to unsolved cases. At his funeral, several retired officers who'd worked the Miller investigation attended. They stood together afterward, talking quietly about the case that had defined their careers and defeated their best efforts. One of them, former Officer Thomas Brennan, said what they were all thinking. "We'll never know what really happened that day. Maybe it's better that way. Some truths are too dark to live with." But no one really believed that. Not knowing was worse than any truth, however dark. Chapter 14. The Witness Who Became a Therapist. Susan Hartley, Jennifer Miller's best friend, struggled throughout adolescence with guilt and trauma from the birthday party. She'd been there. She'd seen Jennifer go into the house. She'd done nothing to stop it, though rationally she knew she couldn't have known what would happen. By high school, Susan was seeing a therapist twice a week. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison specialized in childhood trauma and helped Susan understand that survivor's guilt was normal, that she bore no responsibility for her friend's death, that healing was possible even if it took years. The therapy helped, but Susan never fully recovered. She avoided birthday parties throughout high school, making excuses whenever invited. She couldn't be around balloons or streamers without feeling nauseated. The smell of birthday cake triggered panic attacks. In 1974, Susan graduated from high school and enrolled at the University of Michigan. She initially planned to study literature, Jennifer's favorite subject, as a way of honoring her dead friend. But during her sophomore year, she took a psychology course and found her calling. She wanted to help people who'd experienced trauma, the way Dr. Morrison had helped her. Susan earned her psychology degree in 1978 and continued to graduate school, specializing in child psychology and trauma therapy. Her master's thesis, completed in 1980, was titled Long-Term Effects of Witnessing Violence in Childhood. She didn't mention the Miller murders specifically, but everyone who knew her background understood where the research interest came from. By 1985, Dr. Susan Hartley had established a successful private practice in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She worked primarily with children and adolescents who'd witnessed or experienced violence. Her patient reviews consistently praised her empathy and understanding. She had a gift for connecting with traumatized children because she'd been one herself. In 1991, Susan married another psychologist, David Chen. They had 2 children, daughters born in 1993 and 1995. Susan was a protective mother, perhaps overprotective, always knowing where her children were, always vetting their friends' parents, never allowing them to attend parties without her presence. David understood. He knew about the Miller murders, knew what Susan had witnessed at age 11. He supported her need for control even when it bordered on excessive. Their daughters grew up safe, perhaps slightly sheltered, but loved intensely by a mother who knew how quickly children could be taken. In 2006, on the 40th anniversary of the murders, a local newspaper contacted Susan for an interview. She declined politely but firmly. She'd built a life beyond that terrible day. Revisiting it publicly would serve no purpose, except to reopen wounds that had taken decades to partially heal. But privately, Susan thought about Jennifer every May 14th. She wondered what her friend would have looked like at 50, what career she might have chosen, what family she might have raised. The alternate timeline where Jennifer lived played out in Susan's mind like a ghost story, a life that should have been but never was. Susan retired from her practice in 2015 at age 60. By then, she'd helped hundreds of children process trauma, giving them tools to survive experiences that might have broken them. It was her way of making meaning from tragedy, of ensuring that Jennifer's death hadn't been completely meaningless. In 2023, when the documentary filmmaker contacted her about participating in a film about the Miller case, Susan's refusal was immediate and unequivocal. She'd spent 57 years carrying this weight. She wasn't going to perform her trauma for public consumption, no matter how sensitively presented. Some wounds, Susan believed, should be allowed to scar over in private. The world didn't need to see every injury. Healing happened in darkness and silence, not under lights and cameras. Chapter 15. The Boy Who Stopped Talking. David Murphy was 9 years old when he attended the Miller twins' birthday party. He'd been friends with Jason, bonding over their shared love of baseball and comic books. The murder shattered something fundamental in David's psyche. For 6 weeks after the party, David didn't speak. Not to his parents, not to doctors, not to anyone. He attended school but sat silently at his desk, completing written work but refusing to answer questions verbally. Teachers and school counselors tried various approaches. Nothing worked. David's parents, Frank and Helen Murphy, were desperate. They took him to specialists in Detroit, then Chicago, seeking answers. Selective mutism, the doctor said. Trauma-induced. It might resolve on its own, or it might require intensive therapy. There were no guarantees. In July 1966, David finally spoke again. His first words were to his mother. "Is Jason really dead?" When Helen confirmed that yes, Jason was gone, David cried for hours, the first tears he'd shed since the murders. It was as if speaking the question made it real, in a way silence had protected him from. David slowly returned to verbal communication, but he was changed. The outgoing, energetic boy had become withdrawn and anxious. He had nightmares several times a week, waking up screaming about monsters in basements. He refused to go into his own basement, even in daylight. His parents had to move the washing machine upstairs because David would have panic attacks if his mother went down to do laundry. School became difficult. David's grades dropped. He had trouble concentrating, his mind wandering to that May afternoon, replaying the moment Jason had said he was going inside. If David had gone with him, would things have been different? Could 2 boys have fought off the killer? Or would David be dead too? By high school, David had discovered marijuana and alcohol as coping mechanisms. His parents caught him smoking pot in his room when he was 15. They tried grounding him, therapy, and tough love. Nothing worked. David was self-medicating, numbing pain that counseling couldn't reach. He barely graduated high school in 1975. College was out of the question. David drifted through his 20s, working construction jobs, drinking heavily, getting into bar fights. He was arrested twice for assault and once for drunk driving. Each time, his parents bailed him out, hoping he'd eventually get his life together. In 1983, at age 26, David hit bottom. A DUI accident landed him in the hospital with broken ribs and a punctured lung. The other driver, thankfully, survived with minor injuries. Facing serious charges and potential prison time, David finally agreed to enter rehab. The program was 90 days at a facility in Grand Rapids. During group therapy, David finally talked about the birthday party, about watching his friend go into the house and never come out, about the guilt and the nightmares, and the feeling that he should have died too. The counselors helped him understand that survivors' guilt was common, that addiction was often self-punishment, that healing required forgiveness, including self-forgiveness. David completed the program and managed to stay sober for 8 months. Then he relapsed, disappeared for 3 days on a bender, and had to start over. Recovery wasn't linear. It was messy, with setbacks and failures. But slowly, through the late 80s and into the 90s, David built something resembling stability. He worked as a carpenter, finding satisfaction in building things, in creating order from raw materials. He attended AA meetings religiously. He dated occasionally but never married, afraid of the vulnerability that relationships required. He kept to himself, lived in a small apartment in Warren, Michigan, and avoided May 14th every year by taking vacation time and going camping alone in the Upper Peninsula. In 2001, David received an invitation to a 40th high school reunion. He didn't attend. Too many memories, too many people who knew about the birthday party. He couldn't be the guy whose friend got murdered anymore. He'd spent 35 years trying to be something else, someone else, anyone else. David died in 2019 at age 62 from a heart attack. He was alone when it happened, in his apartment, working on a woodworking project. His landlord found him 3 days later. At his small funeral, attended by a few AA friends and distant cousins, someone mentioned that David had survived a childhood trauma, but most people there didn't know the details, didn't know about Jason Miller, or the birthday party, or the decades of pain David had carried. In his apartment, police found a shoebox in his closet. Inside were baseball cards from 1966, several featuring players Jason Miller had collected. David had kept them for 53 years, unable to throw them away, unable to forget his friend who'd loved baseball and comic books, and had died too young. Chapter 16. The Neighbor's Burden. Beth Ann Foster was 9 years old at the Miller party, younger than most of the other guests. She was the child who'd seen a man near the bulkhead doors, the witness whose tentative identification of Harold Kemp had made him the primary suspect. For years after the murders, Beth Ann wondered if she'd been right. Had the man she saw been Kemp? Or had she picked his photo from a lineup because police wanted her to, because she sensed what answer they needed? Child witnesses are notoriously unreliable, suggestible, eager to please authority figures. Had she sent police after an innocent man? Or worse, if it had been Kemp and he'd been released, was she responsible for a killer going free? These questions tortured Beth Ann throughout her childhood and adolescence. Her parents tried to shield her from the aftermath of the case, but she heard things. Neighbors talking, news reports, the rumors that Kemp had been released because the evidence wasn't strong enough. If her identification had been more certain, more definitive, would that have made a difference? Beth Ann struggled in school, not because of intelligence, but because of anxiety. She couldn't focus on lessons when her mind was replaying that afternoon, trying to sharpen a memory that grew fuzzier with time. By high school, she couldn't say with certainty what the man near the bulkhead had looked like. Had he been tall or average height, young or middle-aged? The details had blurred together, replaced by the photo of Harold Kemp that police had shown her. She graduated from high school in 1975 and immediately left Michigan. She enrolled at the University of Arizona, as far from Livonia as she could get while staying in the continental United States. She told her parents she wanted warm weather and a fresh start. The truth was, she couldn't live in the same state where the murders had occurred, where she might run into other party guests, where people might recognize her name and remember her as the witness who couldn't be sure. Beth Ann earned a degree in education and became an elementary school teacher. She was good at her job, patient with children, attuned to signs of trauma or abuse. She'd learned young that terrible things could happen to children, that adults couldn't always protect them, that vigilance was necessary. She married in 1982, a man named Robert Foster who worked as an accountant. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Beth Ann was intensely protective of them, perhaps too protective. She didn't allow sleepovers at other children's houses. She insisted on meeting and vetting every adult who interacted with her kids. She taught them about stranger danger, about saying no to adults who made them uncomfortable, about the reality of evil in the world. Her children thought she was paranoid. Her husband gently suggested she might be overreacting based on her own childhood experiences. Beth Ann knew they were probably right, but she couldn't help it. She'd seen what happened when parents let their guard down, when they assumed neighborhood birthday parties were safe. Beth Ann never told her children about the Miller murders. She didn't want to pass on her trauma, didn't want them looking up the case and seeing her name in old police reports. She wanted them to have the innocence she'd lost at 9 years old. In 2005, Beth Ann's husband died suddenly from an aneurysm at age 54. The loss devastated her, bringing back all the old feelings about sudden death and life's fragility. She retired from teaching the following year. Unable to maintain the emotional energy required for the job, she lived quietly in Tucson, gardening, reading, visiting her grandchildren. She still thought about Jennifer and Jason every May 14th, still wondered about the man at the bulkhead doors, still carried the weight of uncertain testimony that might have mattered or might have meant nothing. When the documentary filmmaker contacted her in 2023, Beth Ann's refusal was polite but firm. She'd carried this burden for 57 years. She wasn't going to resurrect it for a film. "Let the past stay buried," she wrote. "Some stories don't need to be told again." But at night, alone in her house in Arizona, Beth Ann still occasionally dreamed about that May afternoon. In the dreams, she saw the man clearly, every detail sharp and undeniable. She turned to tell someone, to report what she'd seen, but her voice wouldn't work. She tried to scream a warning, but no sound came out, and then she'd wake up, heart pounding, knowing that even in dreams, she couldn't change what had happened. Chapter 17. The Parents Who Couldn't Survive. Carol and Robert Miller's marriage had been strong before May 14th, 1966. They'd met in college, married young, built a life together in the suburbs. Their twin children had been the center of their world, the reason they worked hard and saved money and planned for the future. After the murders, they had nothing. Their children were gone. Their house was a crime scene contaminated by violence. Their future, as they'd imagined it, was erased, and they only had each other, 2 people drowning in grief so profound that neither could help the other stay afloat. They tried. In the weeks after the funerals, they attended grief counseling together. The counselor, a well-meaning woman in her 50s, suggested strategies for coping. Take walks together, talk about happy memories of the twins, lean on each other for support. The advice was reasonable, but impossible to follow. Carol couldn't talk about the twins without breaking down completely. The happy memories were contaminated by knowledge of how the story ended. Taking walks meant leaving the house, which Carol couldn't do without seeing the spot where Jennifer and Jason had played, where the birthday party had happened, where everything had gone wrong. Robert threw himself into work, spending 12 hours a day at Ford, taking extra shifts, volunteering for projects, anything to avoid being home, avoid the empty bedrooms, avoid his wife's hollow-eyed stare. He knew he was abandoning Carol emotionally, but he didn't know how to be present for her when he was barely surviving himself. They moved out of the Oakwood Avenue house in September 1966, unable to live where their children had died. They rented an apartment in Dearborn, anonymous and temporary. The plan was to eventually buy another house, start over, maybe try for another child. But the plan never materialized. Carol started drinking heavily. Wine at first, then vodka, which she could hide in juice or coffee. Robert noticed but didn't confront it. He understood the need to numb the pain. He was doing the same thing with work, with television, with anything that kept his mind occupied and away from the thoughts that waited in every quiet moment. By 1967, they rarely spoke to each other. They existed in the same apartment, but lived separate lives, 2 ghosts haunting the same space. When they did interact, it often ended in arguments. Robert thought Carol should try harder to move forward. Carol thought Robert was callous for being able to work and function. Both were wrong, and both were right. The final breaking point came in March 1969, almost 3 years after the murders. Carol had been drinking all afternoon when Robert came home from work. She was sitting in the living room with photo albums spread around her, crying over pictures of Jennifer and Jason at various ages. "You never loved them," she said when Robert walked in. The accusation was absurd, born from alcohol and pain rather than logic. "That's not true, and you know it," Robert replied. "Exhausted from another 12-hour shift, and in no mood for this fight. You work all the time. You never talk about them. It's like they never existed. I work because we need money. I don't talk about them because it hurts too much. That doesn't mean I didn't love them. You've moved on. You've forgotten them." Robert stared at his wife, this woman he'd loved since he was 20 years old, now transformed into someone he barely recognized. "I haven't moved on, Carol. I'll never move on. But I have to keep living. I don't know how else to do this." Carol stood up, unsteady on her feet. "Then keep living, but do it without me." She moved out the next day, staying with her sister in Ohio. The divorce was finalized in August 1969. They split their minimal assets. Neither wanted the furniture, the photo albums, anything that reminded them of their life together. It all went to charity or trash. Carol never recovered. She moved from her sister's house to a series of apartments, worked sporadic jobs as a receptionist or clerk, drank steadily. Her sister tried to help, staged an intervention in 1972, got Carol into rehab. It didn't stick. Carol would be sober for weeks, then relapse, the cycle repeating endlessly. She died in January 1976 at age 42. The death certificate listed heart failure, but her sister told people it was really heartbreak. Carol had died the day her children were murdered. The following 10 years had just been her body catching up to that reality. Robert remarried in 1978 to a widow named Patricia, who'd lost her own spouse to cancer. They understood each other's grief, had realistic expectations, and built a stable, if not passionate, marriage. Robert never told Patricia the full details of Jennifer and Jason's deaths. She knew he'd had children who died, but he couldn't bring himself to describe the birthday party, the basement, the horror of that discovery. Robert retired from Ford in 1992, after 40 years with the company. He and Patricia lived quietly in Canton, Michigan, traveling occasionally, visiting Patricia's adult children from her first marriage. Robert was a good stepfather, attentive to her kids and grandkids, but everyone understood he was maintaining distance, protecting himself from attachment that could lead to more loss. He died in 2003 at age 76, from complications of pneumonia. At his funeral, Patricia found a locked box in his office. Inside were 2 wristwatches, children's watches from the 1960s, still set to 4:05 p.m. The time, Patricia realized, when Jennifer and Jason had been discovered dead. Robert had kept the watches, the gifts he'd given his children on their last birthday, and had never been able to move the hands forward past the moment when time stopped for his family. Patricia buried the watches with him, unable to throw them away, but unable to keep them either. Some grief, she understood, was simply too heavy to carry. Chapter 18. The Prosecutor's Regret. Martin Richardson had been the Wayne County prosecutor in 1966, responsible for deciding whether to charge Harold Kemp with the Miller murders. His decision not to proceed had been legally sound, but personally haunting. Richardson had reviewed the evidence carefully: circumstantial connections, tentative witness identification, matching blood type shared by millions. Any defense attorney would dismantle the case easily. A failed prosecution would mean double jeopardy, preventing any future trial even if stronger evidence emerged. The responsible choice was to wait, to build a stronger case before proceeding. Except that stronger evidence never emerged. Harold Kemp was released, moved away, and died 16 years later without ever being charged. If he was guilty, he'd escaped justice entirely. If he was innocent, he'd been unfairly suspected and harassed for years. Either outcome was unsatisfying. Richardson continued as prosecutor until 1978, handling hundreds of cases, winning most of them. But the Miller murders stayed with him, a professional failure that overshadowed his successes. At night, he'd replay the decision, wondering if he'd made the right call. Should he have taken the case to trial despite its weaknesses? Would a jury have convicted based on the evidence they had? The problem was that Richardson knew, intellectually, that his decision had been correct. Prosecutors had a responsibility not to pursue charges they couldn't prove. Taking weak cases to trial wasted resources and risked letting actual criminals walk free on double jeopardy technicalities. He'd followed proper procedure, but procedure didn't help Jennifer and Jason Miller. Procedure didn't give their parents closure. Procedure didn't heal the community or punish whoever had committed these murders. Sometimes, Richardson came to understand, following the rules still led to wrong outcomes. In 1981, Richardson left the prosecutor's office and entered private practice, specializing in criminal defense. The career change surprised people who'd known him as a tough prosecutor. Richardson explained it simply. He'd spent 15 years putting people in prison. Now he wanted to ensure that only guilty people went to prison, that innocent people had vigorous representation. But former colleagues whispered that the real reason was the Miller case. Richardson couldn't shake the possibility that Harold Kemp had been innocent, that his investigation had ruined an innocent man's life. Switching to defense work was penance, a way of balancing the scales. As a defense attorney, Richardson was meticulous and successful. He won acquittals in cases that seemed unwinnable. He negotiated favorable plea deals. He made sure his clients' rights were protected at every stage. And whenever he defended someone accused of a heinous crime, someone the public assumed was guilty, Richardson thought about Harold Kemp and how assumption wasn't the same as proof. Richardson retired in 2005 at age 72. By then, he'd defended murderers, rapists, and pedophiles, ensuring they received fair trials. Some were acquitted and released. Richardson slept fine after those cases, knowing the system had worked properly. That presumption of innocence meant something. But he never forgot the Miller case, the children who'd died while he'd been too cautious to take a chance on a weak prosecution. In retirement, he wrote a memoir about his legal career, including a chapter on the Miller murders. He defended his decision not to charge Kemp, laying out the legal reasoning clearly. But he ended the chapter with a confession. I don't know if we had the right suspect. I don't know if Harold Kemp killed Jennifer and Jason Miller, but I do know that 2 children died, and no one was ever held accountable. That failure, whether it belongs to me or to the justice system generally, is something I'll carry until my death. Sometimes following the law isn't enough. Sometimes justice requires more than procedure. I didn't provide that in 1966, and I've regretted it ever since. Richardson died in 2016 at age 83. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his distinguished career, but made no reference to specific cases. Only those close to him knew that the Miller murders had defined his life as much as any verdict he'd won or lost. Chapter 19. The Cold Case. Detective Sarah Chen joined the Detroit Police Department in 1998, 22 years old and determined to make a difference. She worked patrol for 5 years, then moved to homicide, proving herself on fresh cases before eventually being assigned to the Cold Case Unit in 2008. The Cold Case Unit was understaffed and underfunded, as such units typically were. Dozens of unsolved murders waited in filing cabinets and storage boxes, cases stretching back decades. Sarah's job was to review them periodically, applying new forensic techniques or following up on new leads when they emerged. The Miller case caught her attention immediately. Twin children murdered at their birthday party in a suburban home, multiple witnesses, extensive investigation, primary suspect identified, but never charged, files sealed by judicial order. It was exactly the kind of high-profile cold case that could make a detective's career if solved. Sarah requested permission to review the sealed files. The request was denied. She tried again with more detailed justification. Denied again. The judge who'd sealed the files in 1996 was still on the bench and protective of his decision. The witnesses, now in their 50s and 60s, had a right to privacy. The Miller family, what remained of it, deserved peace. Frustrated but not deterred, Sarah worked with what public information existed. She tracked down police reports that hadn't been sealed, interviewed retired detectives who'd worked the case, and located a few witnesses willing to speak off the record. Former Officer Thomas Brennan, now 81 and living in a nursing home, spoke with Sarah in 2009. His memory was sharp despite his age. He described finding the bodies in the basement, the horror of seeing children who'd been alive and happy just minutes before, now dead in their birthday clothes. We knew it was Kemp, Brennan told Sarah. Everyone knew, but knowing and proving are different things. We couldn't prove it. What if it wasn't Kemp? Sarah asked. What if the real killer was never investigated because everyone assumed it was him? Brennan considered this. That's possible, but Kemp fit the profile. History of inappropriate behavior with kids. No alibi. Possibly seen near the crime scene. If it wasn't him, it was someone remarkably similar to him. Sarah tracked down Harold Kemp's relatives, few as they were. A niece living in Kentucky agreed to speak with her. The niece, Dorothy Barnes, had been 12 in 1966 and remembered her uncle being arrested and released. Uncle Harold was strange, Dorothy told Sarah over the phone. Nobody in the family liked him much, but I don't think he killed those kids. He was a lot of things, but violent wasn't one of them. He was more pathetic than dangerous, you know? Like a lonely, broken person who didn't know how to function around other people. Did he ever do anything inappropriate? With you or other children in the family? Dorothy hesitated. He made me uncomfortable. The way he'd look at kids, longer than normal. But he never touched me, never said anything directly wrong. Just gave off a creepy vibe. So you think he was innocent? I think the police needed someone to blame. And Uncle Harold was easy. Whether he did it or not, I can't say. But if he did, he took it to his grave without ever admitting it. Sarah's investigation stalled on the sealed evidence. Without access to the biological samples collected in 1966, she couldn't run modern DNA analysis. Without crime scene photos and detailed forensic reports, she couldn't apply new investigative techniques. The judicial seal was absolute. She made one final attempt in 2010, petitioning directly to the original judge with a detailed explanation of how DNA technology could potentially solve the case. The judge considered it, held a closed hearing, and ultimately denied the request. His written opinion was clear. While the court appreciates the detective's dedication and understands the value of modern forensic techniques, the right to privacy of the witnesses, now adults with families and careers, outweighs the speculative possibility of solving this cold case. The witnesses have rebuilt their lives after childhood trauma. Reopening this case publicly would cause them significant harm. Additionally, the primary suspect is deceased and cannot be brought to justice regardless of what evidence might reveal. For these reasons, the seal remains in effect. Sarah was disappointed, but understood the reasoning. The law had to balance justice against privacy, closure against harm. Sometimes privacy won. Sometimes the traumatized deserved protection more than the public deserved answers. She closed her informal investigation and moved on to other cold cases, some of which she successfully solved. But the Miller murders stayed in her mind, another reminder that not all questions have answers, not all cases can be solved, and not all families get closure. In 2020, Sarah retired from the police force after 22 years of service. At her retirement party, someone asked what unsolved case bothered her most. Without hesitation, she said the Miller twins. 2 children killed at their birthday party, a monster who was never caught, and a system that did its best but still failed. That case, Sarah said, represented everything difficult about police work. The limitations, the frustrations, the knowledge that good intentions and hard work weren't always enough. Chapter 20. The community that changed Livonia, Michigan in 1966 was a community of roughly 100,000 people, predominantly white, middle-class, suburban families. It was the kind of place where kids rode bikes unsupervised, where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors knew each other and looked out for each other's children. The Miller murders shattered that innocence completely. Within weeks of the crime, parents throughout Livonia were implementing new safety measures. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised. Birthday parties required parent chaperones at strict ratios, 1 adult for every 3 to 5 children. Background checks became standard for anyone working with kids, though such checks were limited by available technology in the 1960s. Schools implemented new security protocols. Jefferson Elementary, where Jennifer and Jason had been students, installed locks on all classroom doors and established procedures for screening visitors. Other schools throughout the district followed suit. The PTA organized safety committees, bringing in police officers to teach children about stranger danger. But the heightened security came with costs. Children lost freedom they'd previously enjoyed. The unsupervised play that had characterized childhood for generations disappeared, replaced by scheduled activities and constant adult supervision. Some parents recognized this as a loss, but felt they had no choice. Safety trumped freedom. Protection mattered more than independence. The Oakwood Avenue neighborhood never fully recovered. The Miller house changed hands multiple times over the following years, each new owner eventually leaving. The property got a reputation as unlucky or cursed, though the reality was simpler. Living where children had been brutally murdered was psychologically untenable for most families. By the mid-70s, Property values on Oakwood Avenue had declined significantly compared to similar streets in Livonia. The neighborhood acquired an unofficial stigma. Real estate agents showing houses nearby would avoid mentioning the street's history, but prospective buyers usually discovered it through their own research or neighborhood gossip. In 1984, the Miller house was purchased by an investor who attempted to renovate and flip it. The renovation was completed, but the house sat on the market for 2 years without a serious offer. The investor eventually sold it at a loss to a family relocating from out of state who didn't know the history. That family, the Hendersons, lived there for 3 years before marital problems forced a divorce and sale. During those 3 years, their children reported feeling uncomfortable in the basement, refusing to go down there alone. Mrs. Henderson admitted to friends that she sometimes heard noises in the house that couldn't be explained, though she attributed this to old pipes and settling foundation rather than anything supernatural. The house changed hands twice more in the 90s, before finally being purchased in 2004 by a developer who demolished it. The lot remained empty for years, weeds growing through cracks in the old foundation. Neighbors were relieved to have the house gone, the constant physical reminder of tragedy finally removed. But removing a building didn't erase memory. Older residents still referred to the empty lot as where the Miller house was. Children growing up on the street learned the story from their parents or older siblings, often as a cautionary tale about strangers and danger. By 2020, most of the families who'd lived on Oakwood Avenue in 1966 had moved away or died. The street had turned over completely, younger generations buying the affordable houses without knowing the history. But the story persisted in local lore, one of those dark tales that defines a community even as the people who lived through it disappear. Livonia as a whole moved forward, growing to over 95,000 residents by 2020. It remained a safe, prosperous suburb, consistently ranking among Michigan's best places to live. Crime rates were low, schools were good, families thrived there. But longtime residents never forgot that safety was an illusion, that terrible things could happen anywhere, and that innocence, once lost, could never be fully restored. The Miller murders had taught Livonia that lesson permanently, and the community had changed in response, becoming more cautious, more protective, less trusting. Whether that change represented wisdom or tragedy was a question without a clear answer. Chapter 21. The Files That Stayed Sealed. The Judicial Order, sealing the Miller case files in 1996, came after a petition from several of the witnesses who'd been children at the birthday party. Now adults with careers and families, they argued that their privacy rights outweighed public interest in an unsolved, decades-old murder. The judge, William Harrison, had reviewed the files carefully before making his decision. He'd read the witness statements given by traumatized children in 1966. He'd seen crime scene photos that were disturbing even to someone accustomed to evidence in violent cases. He'd reviewed psychiatric evaluations of the child witnesses showing long-term trauma. Judge Harrison's written opinion explained his reasoning. While unsolved murders remain of legitimate public interest, and while the families of victims deserve closure, these interests must be balanced against the rights of witnesses, who were themselves victims of this crime, in a different sense. The children who attended the Miller twins' birthday party did not merely witness a crime scene. They were present during the murders, playing in a yard while their friends were being killed nearby. They have carried this trauma for 30 years. Several have documented psychological damage directly attributable to their experiences that day. Opening these files to public scrutiny would require these individuals to relive their trauma publicly. Their names would become associated with this case in perpetuity, searchable online, subject to true crime speculation and amateur investigation. This court finds that such harm outweighs the speculative possibility that public access might somehow lead to solving the case. Additionally, the primary suspect in this case is deceased. Even if new evidence were discovered pointing definitively to Harold Kemp's guilt or innocence, justice could not be served through prosecution. The windows for both punishment and exoneration have closed with his death. For these reasons, the court orders that all files related to the Miller investigation be sealed indefinitely. Access will be granted only under extraordinary circumstances, and only with court approval after notice to all affected parties. The decision was controversial. The Detroit Free Press ran an editorial criticizing it as excessive secrecy that prevented closure for the Miller family and hindered law enforcement's ability to apply new techniques to cold cases. True crime advocates argued that public interest in unsolved murders was legitimate and that sealing files set dangerous precedent. But victims' rights groups supported the decision, praising Judge Harrison for prioritizing witness welfare over public curiosity. The witnesses themselves expressed relief. Susan Hartley, speaking through her attorney, released a statement. "I've spent 30 years trying to build a life beyond the worst day of my childhood. Opening those files would make that impossible. I appreciate the court's recognition that witnesses have rights too, that we deserve to move forward in privacy." The sealed files sat in a Wayne County storage facility, in a climate-controlled room with restricted access. Physically, they consisted of 12 boxes containing police reports, witness statements, crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, forensic analyses, and investigative notes. The boxes were labeled with the case number and the judicial seal order, warning that unauthorized access was a criminal offense. Over the years, various parties attempted to unseal the files. Journalists filed Freedom of Information Act requests, which were denied based on the judicial seal. True crime authors petitioned for access, arguing that they would anonymize witness identities, also denied. In 2015, a podcaster specializing in cold cases tried to argue that enough time had passed and most witnesses were now in their 60s, making privacy concerns less relevant. The petition was rejected. Judge Harrison, who retired in 2002, maintained until his death in 2018 that sealing the files had been the right decision. In an interview shortly before his retirement, he addressed the controversy. "People want closure, and I understand that. But closure can't come at the expense of people who've already suffered enough. Those children lost their innocence at age 9, 10, 11. They've spent their lives dealing with that loss. Making them public figures in their trauma wouldn't bring the Miller twins back. It would only create new victims." The files remained sealed through 2025, nearly 60 years after the murders. Barring a court order, they would likely stay sealed permanently. Their contents known only to those who'd examined them before the seal took effect, and to the handful of officials with legitimate access. In practical terms, this meant the truth about Jennifer and Jason Miller's deaths might never be fully known. Whatever evidence existed, whatever clues remained undiscovered, whatever conclusions could be drawn from modern analysis, all of it stayed locked away in those 12 boxes in climate-controlled storage. Some people found this intolerable, a failure of justice and transparency. Others found it necessary, a recognition that not all truths need to be public, and not all questions need answers if finding those answers causes more harm. The debate continued, but the files stayed sealed. And in those sealed boxes, Jennifer and Jason Miller remained frozen at age 10, birthday party victims whose story would be told and retold, but never fully revealed. Epilogue. 60 years later, in May 2026, 60 years after the murders, a small memorial service was held at Parkview Memorial Cemetery, where Jennifer and Jason Miller were buried. Only 3 people attended: a distant cousin of the Millers who'd never met the twins, a local historian researching suburban crime, and an elderly woman who didn't give her name. The graves were well maintained, the small headstones simple but cared for. Someone, perhaps the cemetery staff or perhaps anonymous visitors, occasionally left flowers. On this particular afternoon, the 3 attendees stood quietly for a moment, each with their own reasons for being there. The historian, Marcus Webb, took photos for his research. He was writing a book about how the Miller murders had changed suburban American culture, arguing that this one incident in Livonia, Michigan, had contributed to a broader transformation in how Americans thought about childhood safety and community trust. The distant cousin, Patricia Miller Chen, had found out about the murders only recently while researching family history. She'd been shocked to discover that her father's second cousins had been murdered as children. She felt obligated to pay respects, to acknowledge family tragedy even though she'd never known them. The elderly woman stood the longest, staring at the graves with an expression that mixed grief and guilt. When the others left, she remained. She knelt awkwardly, her 70-year-old knees protesting, and placed her hand on Jennifer's headstone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't help you. I didn't know. I didn't understand." This was Beth Ann Foster, the 9-year-old witness who'd seen a man near the bulkhead doors, who'd tentatively identified Harold Kemp from a photo lineup, who'd carried the burden of uncertain testimony for 6 decades. She'd sworn she'd never return to Michigan, never think about the case again. But as she entered her 70s, facing her own mortality, The need for some kind of closure had brought her back. Beth Ann stayed at the grave for 30 minutes, talking quietly to children who'd been dead for 60 years. She told them about her life, about her children and grandchildren, about the career she'd built, and the ways she'd tried to make meaning from tragedy. She told them she hoped they were at peace, wherever they were, and that she hoped someday she'd find peace too. When she finally stood up, joints aching, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the base of Jason's headstone was a small toy truck, weathered by exposure to elements but still recognizable. Someone had left it recently. Beth Ann picked it up, examining it. A blue truck, not unlike the toy trucks boys played with in the 1960s. She looked around the cemetery, wondering who'd left it, but the grounds were empty except for her. She placed the truck back carefully, a small tribute from an unknown mourner to a boy who'd loved trucks and baseball and comic books, and had died before he could grow up to enjoy any of them. Beth Ann left the cemetery and drove directly to the Detroit airport. She'd flown in that morning and was flying out that evening, limiting her time in Michigan to the absolute minimum. As the plane took off, carrying her back to Arizona, she looked down at the sprawling suburbs below. Somewhere down there was Livonia and Oakwood Avenue, and the empty lot where the Miller house had stood. 60 years, 2 generations. The world had changed completely since that May afternoon in 1966. The Vietnam War had ended. Men had walked on the moon. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The internet had been invented. Entire technologies, entire cultural movements, entire ways of living had emerged and sometimes disappeared again. But Jennifer and Jason Miller remained 10 years old, forever preserved in school photos and family memories and cold case files. They'd never experienced any of the changes, never graduated high school, never fallen in love, never pursued careers or raised families. They'd been stopped at 10 years old, on their birthday, in their own home, by violence that should never have touched them. And 60 years later, no one knew for certain who'd killed them or why. The most likely suspect was long dead. The witnesses were elderly, many already deceased themselves. The evidence was sealed. The case was as cold as cases could be. In Livonia, life continued. New families moved into houses on Oakwood Avenue. Children played in yards and rode bikes on sidewalks. Birthday parties were celebrated, with balloons and cake and presents, though always now with more supervision, more caution, more awareness that safety couldn't be taken for granted. The Miller murders had receded into history, still remembered by some but forgotten by many. New tragedies had occurred. New crimes had shocked the community. The endless march of time moved forward, leaving even terrible events eventually behind. But in a storage facility in Wayne County, 12 boxes of sealed files remained, silent witnesses to one of Michigan's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. The files contained the truth, or at least part of it, locked away from public view. And somewhere, perhaps nowhere, perhaps everywhere, the person who'd killed Jennifer and Jason Miller had lived their life and possibly died, carrying their secret to whatever lay beyond. If they'd felt guilt, they'd never expressed it. If they'd wanted to confess, they'd never done so. If they'd killed others, those crimes had gone unconnected. The story had no ending because the truth had been lost, deliberately hidden or simply unknowable after 6 decades. What remained was memory, trauma, unanswered questions, and the permanent mark left on a community that had learned too violently that innocence was fragile and monsters could live anywhere. Jennifer Lynn Miller and Jason Robert Miller, born May 14, 1956, murdered May 14, 1966. 10 years old forever. Gone but not forgotten. Unsolved but not abandoned. A tragedy without resolution, a crime without justice, and a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. The birthday party massacre endures not as a solved mystery, but as an open question, a cautionary tale, and a permanent scar on the American suburban dream. 60 years later, the children are still dead, the killer is still unknown, and the questions still have no answers. Some stories don't end. They just stop being told as often, fading into background noise, carried forward by fewer and fewer people until eventually no one remains who remembers firsthand. But the facts persist, documented in sealed files, and the impact ripples outward through generations, shaping how we think about safety and trust, and the terrible things that can happen when we let our guard down for even a moment.